Hello, this is Peter Whitehead. Welcome to one of the series of talks which I started to develop for the Bromley University of the Third Age Art Appreciation Group during the pandemic when we couldn't meet. The Art Appreciation Group is a group of people who are interested in art and like to talk about art and find out about it, but are in no way experts. So today, the subject of the talk is Stanley Spencer, an English artist of the first half of the last century. He's a very unique painter. He painted many religious subjects, but not in a conventional way. He had his own idiosyncratic approach to religion. He was a man of strong religious beliefs, but not necessarily connected to any particular church. He was a significant war artist, both in the aftermath of the Great War in which he served and as someone who documented the industrial efforts during the Second World War. The village in Berkshire in which he was born and lived most of his life, which is Cookham, is also a very important influence on his painting. Many of his religious paintings are set in Cookham in a contemporary setting, and he regarded Cookham as a holy suburb of heaven. But let's start with some biographical details. Stanley was the 9th child of William Spencer, an organist and music teacher. His father was not that impressed by the local schools, and Stanley never went to a school. He was educated at home by his older sisters. His father read the Bible aloud to the family, and that left Stanley with a deep knowledge of the Bible, but this individual approach to religion which I've mentioned. After some initial training near Cookham in Maidenhead in drawing and some studying with private tutors, he went to the Slade School of Art in 1908. Where he was a student alongside other well-known painters such as Bomberg, Nevinson and Paul Nash, and he was taught by Henry Tonks. He was a very self-contained, perhaps naive, perhaps shy person. His father took him every day to the Slade until he had the confidence to travel alone. But he walked 2 miles to Maidenhead for the 8:50 to Paddington every day, returning on the 5:08 in order to be home for tea. And this caused him to be given the nickname at the Slade of Cookham. He was known as Cookham. He didn't really form part of any particular art movement. He was on the fringes of many. The group at the Slade at that time, which was influential, called themselves Neo-Primitives. They were very influenced by early Italian painters like Giotto, and in that sense they were very similar to the Pre-Raphaelites of a few generations earlier. Stanley was always small. As an adult, he was only just over 5 feet tall. But despite that, he served in the Great War, initially as a medical orderly in Bristol, and then he served in Salonika, both on the medical side and as a fighting infantry soldier. And his brother Sidney was killed in the war. After the war, he returns, and after an on-off relationship, he married Hilda Carline in 1925 when he was 33. She had been a fellow student of his at the Slade. Later on we'll see that his marital status was not always very simple. He also had a difficult relationship with the Royal Academy, elected in 1932 but resigned shortly afterwards. But at the end of his life he was more acknowledged. He was re-elected to the Royal Academy, knighted in 1958 and died in 1959. So where is Cookham? For those who don't know, it's called in 2011. It was called by the Telegraph Britain's second richest village, the richest one being East Horsley in Surrey. It's a small town on the banks of the River Thames, in the home counties, part of that rural belt surrounding London. London was easily accessible once the railway arrived, but it is a fairly rural part of the country, and of course was even more so 120 years ago. Other residents of Cookham: Kenneth Graham of Wind in the Willows fame, Enid Blyton, the famous children's writer, and another artist buried in Cookham, Frederick Walker, a Victorian watercolourist, was very well known at the time. I went to visit Cookham in November 2022 and took some photos, which I'm going to share with you. This is Fernley in Cookham High Street. It's the Spencer family home, and you can see from the blue plaque above the door, this was where Spencer grew up, and it's where he lived at the end of his life as well. The Spencers were a fairly wealthy family. His grandfather, I think, had built these two houses in Cookham. This is the corner of the High Street in Cookham, and the white building is now the Stanley Spencer Gallery. It was the Wesleyan Chapel where Spencer worshipped. It's only about 50 yards down the road from Fernley. A busy village now, but you can imagine how it would have been at the turn of the 20th century without all those cars parked in the garage on the left. This is one of Spencer's early works, and you can perhaps see here the post-impressionist influence of Cézanne. Early inspirations for Spencer were the Pre-Raphaelites and the book illustrations of Arthur Rackham. This painting was dismissed by Henry Tonks, who was Spencer's tutor at the Slade, who said it was clearly influenced by the post-impressionist exhibition at the Grafton Gallery in 1910, when quite a lot of Cézanne's work had been displayed. And this work itself ended up in a post-impressionist exhibition in 1912. The subject, John Donne arriving in heaven, John Donne, the 17th century clergyman and poet, Spencer had been given a book of his sermons, and that inspired him to write this scene of John Donne arriving in heaven. But Spencer was developing his own style, and this is more kind of recognisable as a Spencer painting. It was painted at Cookham. There was an orchard beyond the garden of Fernley which could be seen from the nursery window, and this is what Spencer depicts here. There's one or two characteristics that you might notice in other Spencer paintings. The first is the figures are very close to the picture plane. What do we mean by that? Well, the picture plane is the kind of transparent division between the space occupied by the viewer and the internal space of the painting. So you will always tend to see Spencer's figures in paintings like this. They seem to be very close to you. They're right up against you, the viewer. The influence here is possibly Gauguin, particularly for the facial features, but this won a prize at the Slade, and you can see also these kind of distortions of scale and form, which Spencer was to play with a lot during his career. As I said, Cookham's a very rural area. This is a photograph I took just on the outskirts of the village. looking probably to the Chilterns to the north, and it's a view that Spencer would have known. And this is a landscape of his, 1914, just before the Great War. Spencer actually, I feel, is a very accomplished landscape artist, but he dismissed his landscape work. He called them pot boilers. What did he mean by that? Well, he meant that they brought in a lot of money. He could always sell paintings like this. They'd find a ready market for paintings like this in the immediate period before the Great War and immediately afterwards as well. They were very popular. These are very naturalistic compared with what we just saw of the apple gatherers, and they're popular, and therefore they bring money in. And because of that, Spencer, I think, slightly looked down at them. He knew he could paint something like this and it would bring in money, and he needed to bring in money at various times, but you feel that his heart is in the more challenging religious works. Some key points from this painting. First of all, it's the elevated viewpoint. Where are we? Well, we seem to be sitting on the top of a tree somewhere, and that's quite common with Spencer's paintings. The viewpoint is quite often quite elevated, surprisingly for a small man. But what Spencer was really developing at this time was his approach of tackling religious scenes or biblical stories from a Cookham perspective, using local locations and local people as models. And here we have Zacharias and Elizabeth. This is set in a local garden in Cookham, and Zacharias and Elizabeth, for those of you who don't know the story, were an elderly couple who had no children. Zacharias, at the foreground, is burning incense in the temple when Gabriel appears, the figure all in white, and says that he and Elizabeth are to be the parents of John the Baptist. You have here also multiple versions of the same figure. In other words, Zacharias is at the front of the painting, making the offering on the altar, but he's also towards the back, arm in arm with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth also appears behind the wall. And in doing this, telling the story by using the same figure several times, Spencer was consciously adopting a technique which had featured in early Italian religious paintings. But 1914, the war comes. As I said, in 1915, Spencer enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps at the Beaufort War Hospital, Bristol. In 1916, he volunteered for overseas service and was assigned as an orderly to the 68th Field Ambulance in Macedonia. He caught malaria, and his medical condition was not good from that time on, and he was eventually discharged from active service because of these frequent bouts of malaria. He had, though, in 1917 transferred to a fighting regiment, the Royal Berkshires, fighting the Bulgarians. This is possibly, Spencer does a lot of self-portraits. We'll see some of them through the course of this presentation. This is possibly the most, what you might term, old masterish of Spencer's portraits. The dark background, the tones, and the slightly mannerist approach of the rather extended neck here. It was bought by Sir Edward Marsh, one of his early patrons, who was Churchill's private secretary, for £18 in 1914. But the war had a significant effect on Spencer, as it did with most people who served in the war. Towards the end of the war, he is appointed an official war artist, and he paints some scenes from memory of what he'd seen during the war. This is what he has to say about this scene, which took place in September 1916. I was standing a little way from the old Greek church, which was being used as a dressing station and operating theatre, and coming there were travois and limbers crammed full of wounded men. One would have thought that the scene was a sordid one, a terrible scene, but I felt there was a grandeur. All those wounded men were calm and at peace with everything, so that pain seemed a small thing with them. I felt there was a spiritual ascendancy over everything. That represents Spencer's ability to see the religious in everyday life. And this painting really depicts peace in the middle of all the confusion. Our eye is drawn to the brightly lit operating theatre at the top, where the mules or horses which are bringing in the wounded on these stretchers, on these limbers, are gazing at what is happening in the operating theatre, while the wounded men patiently wait their turn to be seen. After the war, Spencer produced a series of paintings of Christ's Passion. This is one of them, Christ carrying the cross in the centre of the painting, but this is set in Cookham High Street. The house in the background is Fernley, which is Spencer's family home. He saw two men with ladders walking down the high street. They made the form of a cross, and it made him think that this could be Christ walking down Cookham High Street on his way to crucifixion. At this time he met the Carline family. Richard was a painter, his sister Hilda, and Hilda is who Spencer marries in 1925. But the painting that really made Spencer's name is this one, the Resurrection Cookham, in the Tate now. Spencer did many paintings which he called resurrections. They actually depict what Michelangelo and others would have called the Last Judgment. But Spencer was unhappy with the concept of judgment. His day of resurrection is a happy occasion when the dead rise up of their graves and all meet again, and they're happy to see each other again. Although you can see, particularly on the left-hand side of the painting, some of the wicked being ushered into the corner of their box-like tombs, as if they might be about to be sent off to hell. Spencer was very skilled at developing multi-figure compositions. Richard, Carline, Hilda and Stanley are all in this painting. It was exhibited in a one-man show in 1927 and bought for the Tate. It's a big work. It's 2.7 metres high and 5.5 metres wide. And you can see God and Christ with a child in his arms are in the church porch under the flowering jasmine or whatever that is. And along the church wall in the background we have the prophets. Spencer is in the middle of the painting, the naked figure in the middle, alongside Richard Carline, who is kneeling. Spencer is also on the right hand side in that tomb that deliberately looks like a book. That's Spencer reclining there. And in the background on the right you can see a pleasure boat setting out on the Thames. That is exactly where the Thames is in relation to this church, Holy Trinity Parish Church in Cookham. And I think it's quite an interesting, it's a bit difficult to say whether these people are arriving or leaving on this boat, but of course the idea of being on a boat across water is one that the classical world would have recognised as being ferried across the River Styx. The Times critic in 1927 said that this was the most important picture painted by any English artist in the present century. What makes it so astonishing is the combination in it of careful detail with modern freedom of form. It is as if a pre-Raphaelite had shaken hands with a cubist. This is Holy Trinity Parish Church, Cookham. Recognisably, you know, really English country churchyard, isn't it? And this is what Spencer is depicting. And having made his name with that particular painting, and on the basis of his war experience, Spencer was invited to work here, the Oratory of All Souls. I think it's pronounced Burghclere. I've heard it pronounced many different ways. Burghclere is a village on the Hampshire-Berkshire borders, so down near Newbury. This chapel is a memorial to Lieutenant Sandham, so it's quite often known as the Sandham Memorial Chapel, who died in 1919 of wounds sustained during the Great War. And the chapel, which is the centre of this building, the buildings on either side are almshouses. The chapel was actually built to house Spencer's frescoes rather than him decorating an existing building. But when it came to the crunch, Spencer decided to paint on canvases rather than actually fresco. And the building now is in the care of the National Trust. So this is a view of the chapel, and you can see how richly decorated it is, all by Spencer. Stanley, Hilda and their first daughter Shirin moved to Burghclere in May 1927, and what Spencer depicts here is the commonplace activities in war combined with the religious. It's largely lacking violence and suffering. Another view of the chapel. It's a depiction of soldiers' daily life, really, as Spencer knew it. There are sections including sorting laundry, filling tea urns, reveille, kit inspection, ablutions and scrubbing the floor. All the type of things that Spencer would have done. Behind the altar is this piece, The Resurrection of Soldiers. You can see the soldiers emerging from the ground with their wooden crosses, which is how the graves would have been marked at the time of their death before the War Graves Commission got to work. And they're all emerging, and as with most resurrections by Spencer, they're pleased to see each other again. He also showed scenes that he recognised from his time in the hospital in Bristol. Here we have a group of wounded soldiers with their arms in slings or those triangular bandages on top of a bus. The staff are opening the gates to welcome them in, and it seems to be quite a kind of festive occasion, really. I mean, these wounded soldiers are the lucky ones. They've made it back to Blighty, made it back to England. Again, with this painting, you've got the steep kind of downwards perspective. We're looking at the bus from a high perspective, a high window, who knows, but it's very effective. But Spencer in these works did also depict the reality of life in the trenches. This is a rather cubist approach to the trenches. Wouldn't have been out of place alongside Paul Nash's trench landscapes. Again, we've got the steep perspective, and the sergeant is emerging from his dugout at the front of the painting. He's putting camouflage on his hat, and the soldiers are emerging from underground from their dugouts, and in that sense they're very similar to a resurrection. they're emerging into the light. And Spencer said of this, how marvellous it would be if one morning when we came out of our dugouts, we found that somehow everything was peace and war was no more. This is the cottage that the Spencer family stayed in Burghclere. Again, another one of Spencer's very realistic, naturalistic landscapes. And he also painted portraits, as well as the self-portraits, which I've shown you here. This is Elsie Munday. She was a living servant in the Spencer household in Burghclere. She stayed to look after Spencer after his divorce and failed second marriage. And I said that Hilda Carline was a painter as well. She painted the same subject. They painted alongside each other. And here's her take on Elsie, a full-length portrait this time, with much more background to it. In 1931, the Spencers had moved back to Cookham, Stanley having finished the work at the chapel. Spencer admired this portrait and it hung in Fernley at the time of his death. Here's Spencer in a self-portrait of 1936. Around this time he'd started to develop what was known as the Church House project. If you remember, I said that the chapel at Burghclere was actually built to house his paintings rather than him being asked to decorate an existing building. And he had it in mind that this might happen again. And so when he was designing or thinking about paintings, he had in mind that they might occupy a place in this as yet unbuilt building, which was going to be the home for his future canvases. And many were planned with an eye to a particular place in this building, in its nave, in its aisles and side chapels. It was to be a chapel of peace and love, a mixture of domestic and sacred spaces with a layout based on the High Street Cookham. And there would be chapels devoted to significant women in his life, his wife Hilda, Elsie the servant, and a couple of his lovers. Now, it never happened, but the concept was there and was very relevant to a lot of Spencer's work from this time onwards. This is one of them, the Dustmen or the Lovers. It's another painting on the theme of resurrection, the glorification and magnifying of a dustman. The joy of his bliss is spiritual in the arms of his wife who carries him and experiences the bliss of union. And what Spencer is doing here, and it makes him quite controversial at the time, is conflating religious and spiritual and sexual ecstasy. It's part of a series of works in which women dominate the male physically. Spencer again is in this painting. He's in the centre foreground here, offering up the teapot as a offering to the resurrected dustman, who is held in the arms of his wife while the other women look on. Spencer had been elected to the Royal Academy in 1932, but he was unhappy with the rules and expectations that went with being a Royal Academician. He resigned in 1935 after some of his paintings, including this one, were rejected by the hanging committee for the summer exhibition. C.R. Nevinson said at the time, "Stanley Spencer is far too good an artist to belong to the Academy." He was re-elected in 1950, but only after the president, Munnings, had tried to get him prosecuted for obscenity. Here's another domestic scene, and again recognisably Spencer. Elsie in the foreground wrestles with a baby while she's putting on her gaiters. It's hardly domestic bliss here. Everything seems in confusion. The kitchen grate is being grouted and mended by workmen in the house. This was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1935, but it's a bit too challenging for some critics. The Daily Mail critic said of it, "Nobody challenges Spencer's ability as a craftsman, the skill of his hand. What many people object to are some of his subjects when they are imagined conceptions, i.e. not landscapes. Workman in the house is a tragicomedy. A queer-looking carpenter gazes down the length of an enormous saw. Another man is halfway up the kitchen chimney. In the foreground, a distracted housewife and her child sprawl on the floor." Which I suppose is a straightforward depiction of what you see, but doesn't really capture, I think, what Spencer was trying to convey. Emotionally, Spencer seems to have been permanently a child. He seems to have been rather naive. He had a boyish look until the end of his life, which, you know, with his short stature and kind of haircut in a fringe, which we'll see later, was constant throughout his life. And also in this painting, you've got Hilda reaching down into the chest of drawers and almost crushing the diminutive form of Stanley under there as they try to do a bit of domestic tidying up with the unmade bed in the background. This was one of a series of 9 paintings celebrating the joy and contentment of life with Hilda, but things were about to change, or were in the process of changing. Patricia Preece comes on the scene in 1930 when Spencer meets her in a Cookham tea room. She's an artist in her own right, and there seems to have been some sort of sexual obsession on Spencer's part. He expected somehow that he would be able to live with both Hilda and Patricia in some kind of strange menage a trois, which Hilda would accept, but Hilda was never going to be happy about this. They eventually divorced in 1937 and he married Patricia, but the marriage was never consummated. Patricia refused to sleep with Spencer or even to live with him. She lived with a female friend, Dorothy Hepworth, in Cookham, and it was widely known, I think, that the two ladies were in a lesbian relationship, but Spencer seems not to have realised that. He spent £2,500 on dresses and jewellery for Patricia, and also made over to her the freehold of the house he owned in Cookham on condition she married him. She rewarded him later on by selling the house while he was still living there, pocketing the proceeds and forcing him to go and live in a bedsit in Hampstead, I think. So, a rather challenging individual, Patricia Preece. You find out some funny things when you're researching talks like this. She's got another link with a very famous Englishman, Gilbert Sullivan. Sullivan died in 1900 or so. Gilbert lived on a bit later, and I think in 1911 he was giving swimming lessons in the lake in his house in Harrow to 2 girls. They got into difficulty. Gilbert tried to save them, but in the process had a heart attack and drowned. And one of the girls that he was saving, and did save, was Patricia Preece. So she has, you can make a link there between Gilbert and Sullivan and Stanley Spencer. This is the sort of painting that got Spencer into trouble. There is one which is more explicit, which apparently you can't find a copy of on the internet, where I get most of my images from, because of copyright issues. But it's much more explicit than this. These type of nudes were designed for a special room in the church house. But I think this painting tells you all you need to know about the relationship between Stanley Spencer and Patricia Preece, where the power lay in that relationship. He continues to paint very nice landscapes and domestic scenes like this, including in Cookham Moor. This is the entrance to the village, and the right of the painting here is more thatched, so the thatched cottage, that's where Patricia and Dorothy Hepworth lived, and the path leads to the War Memorial, the cross in the centre, a kind of altar in Spencer's iconography of Cookham. When I went to Cookham, I knew this painting. I thought I'll take a photograph of the site. It's noticeably different. This is the actual path. I'm more or less at the same place that the painting was taken from, but you can see that Spencer had considerably shortened the distance between the viewer and the War Memorial. The War Memorial is there at the end of the path. It's difficult to see in the wide angle. I did a close-up of it as well. And so it's much less dominant in reality than it is in the painting. You've got some looming trees in the background in the painting, which aren't quite so looming in real life. Spencer's brother Sidney is commemorated on the War Memorial, having been killed in action in France on the 23rd of September 1918, about 6 weeks before the end of the war. And just to compare the painting and the photograph, to make the point that what Spencer does is to bring that War Memorial much more into focus by shortening the distance on that causeway. Well, after the breakup, well, if you can call it that, of his marriage to Patricia Preece, who until the end of her life called herself Lady Spencer, he left the turmoil of Cookham and spent some time with his ex-wife's family, the Carlyles, in Hampstead, before settling into an attic flat nearby in solitude. And that led to another one of the series of paintings, Christ in the Wilderness. And this was a series of 40 projected paintings representing Christ's 40 days in the wilderness, and perhaps Spencer's own exile from Cookham. Again, they're designed to be housed in the church house. Only 4 were ever completed, and Christ is shown in thoughtful meditation in each of them. But it's 1939 and world events are about to disrupt Spencer's work again. In the Second World War, he's sent as a war artist to Port Glasgow, where he documented the shipbuilding work at Lithgow's yard. War artists in World War II were deployed to document the life of the nation at war, not just the fighting troops, and this is where Spencer spends virtually all the war in Port Glasgow. He got on well with the shipbuilders. He found a sense of community there, which perhaps replicated the type of community that he was familiar with in Cookham. And he produced some imposing works. It's quite difficult to show them on a slide because this particular one, Burners, is the side panels of the triptych are 50 centimetres high and 200 centimetres long. The central panel is just over 100 centimetres high and 150 centimetres wide. It's difficult to make out a lot of the detail. If you get a chance, it's quite worthwhile focusing in on some of these figures, but you do get a feeling for how uncomfortable this work was. Everyone is uncomfortably close up. The spatial depth is kept to a minimum. There's no escape from the heat, noise and sweat of the shop floor. There's very little perspective in this. Psychologically as well as visually, it's very overpowering. Spencer himself is in the central panel at the top right. That's Spencer with his sketch pad and his sandwiches, I think, observing everything that's going on in this shipyard. Here's another one. This is one of the close-ups of the side panels, riveters, and you can see the men at work riveting the ships. A very interesting use of perspective on the right, where you look into one of these boiler tubes and see the hobnailed boots of the man working inside. He also painted scenes of welders and scenes called Bending the Keel Plate, so he covered the whole of the work that was going on in the shipyard. And here's the last one in this series, Plumbers. He captures every individual, though. Everyone in this painting, or series of paintings, is an individual, and you can see them contributing to the overall sense of community. And I think that is what particularly appealed to Spencer. And it also gave him inspiration for his work after the Second World War. So this is the cemetery at Port Glasgow, overlooking the Clyde here. And this is what Spencer had to say about how he found this particular spot. One evening in Port Glasgow, when unable to write due to a jazz band playing in the drawing room just below me, I walked up along the road past the gasworks to where I saw a cemetery on a gently rising slope. I seemed then to see that it rose in the midst of a great plain, and that all in the plain were resurrecting and moving towards it, and I knew then that the resurrection would be directed from this hill. And this led to what was known as the Port Glasgow Resurrections, a series of 18 canvases completed between 1945 and 1950. On the left in this one, the former inhabitants of Port Glasgow rise up from beneath the paving slabs, embracing each other. And on the right, a similar sense of joyful reunion. Spencer said it was very much like the welcome home parties that were given to the soldiers returning from the Second World War. In the middle is the scene of the miracle of Christ raising Jairus' daughter. That's something in St. Luke's Gospel, I think. Christ raises this girl from the dead. And yet there are unbelievers in this painting. The unbelievers have turned their back and are not watching Christ perform this miracle. Again, that's part of St. Luke's account of this story. And we also get a partial revisiting and reassessment of the Cookham resurrection of the mid-1920s. This version is more frenzied and crowded, but it's all about union and reunion here. Excuse me, everyone meeting joyfully. So by 1950, Spencer is part of the art establishment once more. He's been reinstated in the Royal Academy after Munnings has left. He is appointed CBE in the same year. But in November 1950, Hilda died of cancer. But, you know, in line with his own religious views, Spencer didn't think this was a passing forever. He would see Hilda again, they would meet again. And so he continued to write to her after her death, sometimes in letters which were over 100 pages in length. And the exchange of letters is depicted here. This was intended for the Hilda Chapel in Church House. And it's just a temporary passing. And Spencer is embracing all the letters he's received from Hilda, and she's keeping his letters in her breast. At the end of his life, Spencer returned to Cookham. This is an unfinished work. It's in the Stanley Spencer Gallery if you want to see it, based on Christ preaching at Cookham Regatta. So Christ is in the centre of the painting, sitting in a wicker chair here. But this is an Edwardian regatta, not one in the 1950s. It's a scene that Spencer would have known as a boy or young man. There are many preparatory works on different elements of this composition, over 60 sketches, and it was designed for the river aisle of the church house as an altarpiece. But we're getting towards the end of Spencer's life now. This is an amazing depiction of the crucifixion, full of violence. Where is the crucifixion taking place? In Cookham High Street. Those houses in the background are Cookham High Street. The workmen with the nails and hammers have a sinister pleasure in their work. One of the thieves crucified with Christ hurls insults at him, the one on the right. And on the ground in front of the cross is the fainting Virgin with her arms in a cross shape. What I find slightly surprising and possibly disturbing about this painting is that it was designed for a chapel at Aldenham School. And even more surprising, this is what Spencer said at the unveiling of the painting, is he said to the schoolboys, "It is your governors and you boys who are still nailing Christ to the cross." I bet that went down well. Well, here we have Spencer at the end of his life, walking down the streets of Cookham with his artist material in the frame of an old pram. You can see that pram at the Stanley Spencer Gallery in Cookham. There's a little sign on it, you can't read it in the photograph, which says, "Mr. Spencer respectfully requests that you do not disturb him as he has work to do," or something along those lines. A bit of a local celebrity. But cancer had been diagnosed and he died in 1959. His ashes are buried where you might expect them to be buried, in Cookham churchyard. If you're looking for influences that Spencer has had on other artists, I have to say I think this looks rather Lucian Freud, and at the completely other end of the scale, you might remember an artist called Beryl Cook back in the 1960s and 1970s, whose kind of big bottomed ladies had a very Spencer-esque quality. But we've reached the end for Spencer now. I think he's an interesting figure. I think he's one of a kind. This is his grave in Cookham churchyard in the autumn of 2022. And on the right, the river at Cookham, the peaceful river that he would have known. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Do like it or subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more. There's about a dozen presentations there now, and I hope you'll listen to a few more of them. Thank you for listening today, and I hope that you'll hear another one of these presentations soon. Thank you.